through the year from hell with regard to church news. I also want to thank Bishop Soto for coming in his very generous support of the Lay Formation Project. Thank you very much. So, the question for me is, what happened in the 30 years that have elapsed between Christi Fidelis, 50 years since Vatican II? Since Vatican II proclaimed the era of the laity. What happened? And here's some things I think happened, so far as I can squeeze them into 15 or 20 minutes. And I'm going to begin more than 50 years ago. What's the greatest disaster in church history that ever happened to the laity? Besides bad pews, misaligned kneelers and collection baskets or something like that. What is the greatest disaster to the laity? I think I know what it is. It was the civil constitution of the church during the French Revolution, 1791, in which the Catholic Church, in all of its orders, clerical, lay, and religious, became a department of the state. This is what's called laicization, a term that's used even today. But laicization was never just anti-clerical. In fact, the clergy emerged from it somewhat, a little bit bruised, but not down for the punch. After the civil constitution of the clergy, there were still priests saying Mass, there were still bishops. It was aimed at the laity from the beginning. Brief explanation why. Yes, priests could still minister, but not to laity as laity, but only as citizens. And that complex order that had evolved for centuries in France and in other Catholic countries, in which the laity, as baptized, had their role in the culture of the church, was violently eliminated. The king was decapitated. There's no greater symbol of baptized laity caring for the interests and the people of the church. The estates, 3 estates, were wiped out. Marriage was made purely civil. The first law of non-fault divorce. Corporations were abolished. Guilds were abolished. Who were the people being abolished in the French Revolution? Not the clergy. The religious were, by the way, I have to say. Not the clergy. It was the baptized laity. It was a disaster, and it was such a disaster that not only in France, but across the Catholic world, there was a vigorous response. And there was formed a very successful movement led by both laity and clergy, the aim of which was to protect the unity of the church against these kinds of actions by the state. And they would begin by extricating the clerical command structure from the state. This was called ultramontanism. And in 1870, the church solemnly proclaimed the universal jurisdiction of the Pope and the union of the bishops with the Pope and the union of the faithful, the lay faithful, under the bishops, that this is an integral order that the state cannot interrupt. And it was a remarkably successful movement. We were born into this movement, even if we don't have the historical imagination to go through it all. A church that, armed with modern communications and canon law, was able to create a life for itself, protecting itself from being deranged by powers. So successful, we got through 2 world wars, a global depression, multiple forms of totalitarianism, decolonization, and the rebuilding of Europe quite intact, thank you. In fact, the church ended the 20th century with its institutions and moral reputation remarkably intact. Good job. It worked. And by the way, laity, for generations now, have been quite content and remarkably supportive of this new arrangement. but it had unintended consequences. So I'm not here to reveal any malice or to speak of any malice, but of the unintended consequences of so successfully responding to the crises of modern times. You see, Protestant groups, well, I'm from Oklahoma, or I've lived in Oklahoma for a long time. I mean by Protestant groups, free church tradition groups. They always have to take time to hire and fire their ministers. In fact, it occupies a lot of their time. If you join a Baptist church or a Pentecostal church in Oklahoma, it's a real burden. They have to hire and fire and take care of their ministers. Catholics have it easy. And in fact, Protestants kind of regard their ministers as dogs that have to be tamed and kept on a leash. But Catholics regard their clergy as good cats who can take care of themselves. You can simply check out, the laity can check out for 2 centuries of what's going on in clerical ranks, and you can come home and the house is still intact every time. They're still alive. And part of this is a tribute to the fact that the modern post-French Revolution church really did come up with a good solution that worked for a long time. But it also unintentionally led to a contentment with the underdeveloped notion of the lay vocation. And here are some bullet points. Along the way, let's say since Vatican II proclaimed the era of the laity, that have to do with, I think, laziness and contentment more than ill will. Those of you who are old enough might remember that in the wake of the council, clergy and laity were both stunned by the sexual revolution. The Beatles had more to do with what happened in the church in the late 60s for clergy and laity than the documents of Vatican II. It was often the case anyway. And many clerics and religious wanted to become laity, or some kind of hybrid. And this was not a very favorable environment for appropriating the conciliar teachings. And I think it explains a lot about the very slow progress. Clergy and laity learned to give one another a lot of leeway. Gil said this afternoon, wink and nod. Well, let's just say they gave each other a mulligan. Yeah, I mean, this was a tough era to live through. On issues of sexual morality, divorce, money, and often, by default, a theoretically self-sufficient, maybe legally self-sufficient clerical class meant by lay vocation, it's your business. But by the way, that was entirely reciprocal by the laity. Yeah, when it comes to seminaries, when it comes to recruitment of priests and seminarians, when it comes to the accounts, even when it comes to education, it's your business. So, let me give one example of what I mean by the long truce, post-1870. I encounter it all the time. Perhaps I'm being unfair. I go to another city to give a talk such as this, and I look on my Catholic app on my iPhone for the closest place to go to confession, and I find it. Confessions on Saturday from 3 to 3:30, or by appointment. That's not just something that the clergy is doing, right? There's a deep kind of symbiosis between clergy and laity on that. By the way, I'm not trying to give a moralistic lecture on how often anyone should go to confession. But I grew up in the old church, so I remember the difference. The strict obligation of the Third Baltimore, 1884, the last time we as Americans had a council, as a church. 1884 strictly obliged the lay faithful to send their children and to support Catholic schools. It was an obligation, not an admonition. And when it was quietly dropped in the 1960s. By the way, by the 1960s, it had to change, but that's another matter. But when it was quietly dropped, did the laity take up their task of educating their children religiously? Even though the council and most modern theology of marriage and of family emphasize, in fact, Pius XI went so far as to say, it is one of the essential ends of marriage is the education of your children. Was that picked up? No, it wasn't picked up. By and large, it wasn't. Some homeschooling parents or some others. The colleges and universities are secularized in ways that wasn't just for academic freedom and free inquiry into important subjects, but the secularization tended to correspond to the comfort zones. Many religious orders and congregations, and certainly bishops, were not unhappy to be relieved of the burden of supervising those places anymore. The bishops no longer had to deal with our version, perhaps, of the fourth estate, which are universities and scholars. Parishes, especially in the great suburbia of our country, really did become parish shopping. Mass was geared to different lifestyle choices, none of which I'm condemning, by the way. I'm just showing you a pattern. With regard to sacraments of marriage and penance and communion, all of which bear pretty deeply on laity, it was only lightly supervised. Clergy and laity were a lot alike. Both moved around a lot. Bishops, priests, laity. Both were somewhat careerist. Both were entirely comfortable with the managerial mode of governance. If problems arise, they are to be handled chiefly through public relations. I think that the clergy and the laity just gradually drifted apart. Let's say the clergy inhabiting a theological and legal zone of legal autonomy and self-sufficiency. The laity inhabiting a cultural zone of the same kind. If something like that is roughly the case, we shouldn't be surprised that 2002 and 2018 have become real shocks. Yeah, if there is not cooperation between clergy and laity, if they symbiotically are related in a way that lets the other one be, they're not going to hold each other accountable. Our first instinct, I'll wrap it up with this, for the laity shouldn't be to desire to rule the clergy. By the way, no laity want to do that anyway. I mean, who would want to do that? It would take a lot of work. And they have trouble enough trying to rule their own families, and professional societies and other things that the laity have to do. I think the first thing that has to be reckoned with is exactly what Father Michael brought up, which is to understand, once again, what is the proper nature of the sacramental ministry of the clergy under the bishops, the episcopal office, and what is the proper sphere of the laity, to break a dysfunctional symbiosis going on in this kind of stuff. And how do we hold each other accountable? How do we have co-responsibility? And to teach one another about to call to each other's attention, how without ever intending such a thing, we do squeeze the laity out, although laity are perfectly willing to be squeezed out, but they shouldn't be. I'll give one example, because Father Sweeney said, it's right in the documents of the church that most praise the laity. And I'll give one example. I could give many. This is from Gaudium et Spes, number 76, which is quoted again in Christi Fidelis. By the way, the council having in Lumen Gentium, the doctrine of the church, said, by their very vocation, it is the laity who seek the kingdom of God by engaging in temporal affairs and by ordering them according to the plan of God. It's a very famous quotation. Well, here is Gaudium et Spes. The church, capital C, by reason of her role and competence, is not identified with any political community, nor bound by ties to any political system. She is at once the sign and safeguard of the transcendental dimension of the human person, unquote. But of course, if Lumen Gentium is correct, and it's the special vocation of the laity to engage in temporal affairs and ordering them according to the plan of God, then of course a responsible lay judge or president must have a particular ties to this country, to this constitution. A parent must have particular responsibilities and ties to this family. The physician must have particular ties to this profession and this organization of doctors. In other words, it's in the very nature of ruling and governing in temporal affairs that the laity would be responsible for having particular ties. In fact, they would be judged to be completely irresponsible if they didn't. Okay? And I say, there it is. If we read Gaudium et Spes, just in a kind of straitjacketed way, but a literal way, the laity do not have an ecclesial vocation. Because the ecclesial vocation is not to be identified with any political community, but you can fill in other communities, nor bound by ties to any political system. The church is at once the sign and safeguard of the transcendental dimension of the human person. So what's the vocation of the laity? Doesn't look ecclesial. It looks particular and temporal. Now, obviously, a responsible interpretation of these two passages would want to, smooth them out. But it's one example for what Father Sweeney talked about. There is still an imagination, right? Well, I've already talked beyond my limit because Heidi's already flashing the cards at me. And I have a responsibility to this particular gathering to end on time and to respect my audience. Thank you very much.